Yes.
But have been around young people, you said that it energizes you and it's important for you in your work. Has been around young people that you've seen in the last 5 decades changed you?
Oh, enormously. Oh, but you see, when you work in a lab, and this is what America really contributed to world science. Science really evolved in Europe, powerful science, in England and Germany and Austria. And the German model was brought to the United States. Rockefeller University, the first medical university, was based on the German model. What was different about the American model, and this was first shown by Thomas Hunt Morgan at Columbia, was that it's a democratic model. It's not a hierarchical model. In Germany, what mattered was how senior you were, how influential you were, what family you came from. That determined your rank in the hierarchy. And students were not given that much attention. Thomas Hunt Morgan published books with undergraduate students as co-authors. And in most American labs, everybody's equal. Many of the good ideas in my lab come from students, but that are not necessarily graduate students, postdoctoral students. So it's a very different atmosphere. I'm enormously influenced by them. I'm influenced by women scholars. My wife is an academic, and my daughter is a very gifted lawyer. So I've been encouraging women's careers, and I'm just amazed how difficult, but how accomplished women become as a result of this training. I mean, no matter how egalitarian a marriage is, a woman usually does more in terms of childcare than, at least in my family. So they have more responsibilities, but nonetheless they manage to have wonderful careers. So I'm enormously influenced as a result of my interaction with them. I hope the other is true as well. I hope I have some impact on them. I can vouch for the other. You had a question?
Yes, putting all your expertise together, can you say something about the role of memory and trauma and how the function of memory or lack of memory in dealing with trauma?
Yeah, well, I mean, you asked me, I'm doing a book right now, which Andreas has seen, on Vienna 1900, art and science in Vienna. Monsieur, what the hell am I doing this? I don't know, you know. For me, this is like working through a post-traumatic stress episode. My whole career, if you will, is a response to trying to, I master it by sort of intellectual brute force. Fortunately, I'm not symptomatic. You know, I just waste my time in this book. But people who had, I must tell you that I had a relatively benign experience. I mean, I was beaten up, but I never went to a concentration camp. We lost our belongings, but we didn't lose our lives. People who had concentration camp experience, much, much more difficult. Or, you know, people who were seriously injured, not being beaten up, or women who've been raped. This is very hard. There are now a variety of methods based on things like habituation, which are quite effective. And there are drugs like D-cycloserine, which can be given together with these therapies that are quite useful. So there are good methods now, because post-traumatic stress disorder is a very common sequela from the war. So many war veterans are coming back suffering from this. And the armed services is well aware of it and is trying to provide good therapeutic response to it. Yeah. Yes?
You told how you began your career in the humanities and then moved into the sciences. And I wondered if you had ideas about how your current research in the sciences reflects on memory discourse in the humanities, like trauma studies or other things.
It's influenced me enormously. So when I began, my background in the humanities and the fact that I trained as a psychiatrist, I didn't spend any time on it, but I spent 4 years at the Harvard Medical School being a resident in psychiatry, doing research while I was doing this, because it came after my research experience. So my chairman, being a very enlightened guy, gave me the resources to have a lab, so half my time I spent doing research. My background in the humanities and my psychiatric training, which is really an extension of that, have had an enormous impact on me. When I started to study learning and memory, which required doing behavioral experiments, most people working on electrophysiology in the brain knew nothing about behavior. They were scared to do it. And I've seen crazy people, so why would snails and mice scare me in terms of their behavior. So I learned how you study behavior of these animals, and I did it. I had no hesitation about it. And a lot of my willingness to move into certain directions was stimulated by the fact that I was interested in problems that were broader than many people were looking at the time. And the only reason I would dare to write something on, Rokitansky and the history of medicine in 1840 in Vienna is because I feel comfortable doing that stuff.
Our presumption is that modern soldiers are massively affected by post-traumatic kind of stress syndrome and so on. The history of so-called civilization would suggest rather not, that actually soldiers come back, get demobilized and enter ordinary times of civil society and never even talk about it or think about what it is that they did. Have you had any thoughts about that? And about the culture that we inhabit is actually very, very aware of this. And I think you're absolutely right to say that our governments now actually address these issues in terms of the state of the armed services and the recovery.
There probably are statistics on this. I would question whether your impression is completely correct. Let me just give you one example. There are certain diseases that change over time. Depression is probably more frequent now than it was before. Again, what isn't certain whether it's just we detect it more readily and people are more sensitive to it and less embarrassed to talk about it, okay? A lot of depression was seen before. But schizophrenia, which is very difficult to hide, if you look at the records going back, the McLean Hospital, where I looked at those records, goes back to about 1840. Incidence of schizophrenia is exactly the same then as it is now, and it's practically universal. You see it throughout the world. I can't believe that post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist before. I don't think we were sympathetic to it, that is, people who were handling it, and maybe the people who suffered from it were sort of shoved away. But, the mind did not evolve to all of a sudden became very sensitive to these horrible trauma. It always was. There has been no human evolution since the cave painting 30,000 years ago. So I don't think we're, recognizing something that didn't exist before. Ma'am.
I very much enjoyed your talk and wondered whether you would comment on memory and aging. It seems that as one progresses in age, one seems to come back to foundational experiences in one's youth more. And I've seen that in a lot of memories.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is true for several reasons. One is that memories from childhood are extremely well stored. Your first birthday party you remember made a very profound impression on you because it was the first birthday party you ever had. By the time you've had 60, another birthday comes and goes, but it's a big deal. So a lot of the experiences you have when you're young are initial experiences. And initial experiences really, activate those modulatory systems of the brain. They produce changes in gene expression. They produce growth that persists for a very long period of time. Number one. Number two, there is a tendency, just in terms of one's contemplation, I think our almost intrinsic biological need to complete one's life. To come back and see whether or not it made sense in some. This is one of these, what the hell am I doing in Vienna all the time? I could go to Paris. We have a nice apartment in Paris. What brings me back to Vienna? It's a desire to sort of make a closure of this. And even I think my attempts, although they're so far unsuccessful, to change behavior in Vienna is an attempt to come to grips with that. So I think there are a lot of sort of biological needs. But I think that's not an issue. I think you should be very comfortable and actually satisfied with it. The other aspects, do your memories for current events hold up reasonably well? You're in great shape. Keep it up. Yes.
Has neuroscience studied in detail the process of how the brain forgets? We talked about memory.
Yeah, there are many. What I've done is to give you an outline of what we know. There are many things we don't know. So brain science is very ambitious, but it's at the beginning of really trying to tackle the more complicated problems. And that holds true for memory research. We know very little about how we forget. With habituation, where you present the stimulus over and over again, you can do this. And this is true for anything. If you take Pavlov's dog, and you give a bell and food, right? The animal responds immediately to the food, doesn't respond to the bell. But if you pair the two together, bell, food, it'll salivate to the bell just like it does to the food. But if you now give the bell repeatedly without the food, after a while, you will stop salivating to the bell. So it's called extinction. It's a form of forgetting. But true forgetting, without the presentation of a stimulus, just with time, we know that it occurs. We know the time alone is a factor, but how it occurs, we don't know. Sir?
Yeah, it's my impression that associated with aging, one of the first forms of minor memory loss has to do with the connection with names and faces.
It's a common thing. It's not necessarily, but it's true.
And so I was wondering if you could comment on the nature of that connection and why that happens.
Okay, so names are arbitrary. You know, why his name is on Aristotle? I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that he's wearing a vest and he has a suit and he has, brown hair. It's a completely arbitrary thing, so to associate them is difficult. So to recall it is sometimes very hard. What happens in general with recall, if you can tie it into something that you're absolutely familiar with, it helps to recall because you think of the other thing. So names that you have difficulty with, if you can tie them to the city that you live in or some child's name or something like that, it'll make it easy to recall. Face recognition, which is difficult, is called prosopagnosia, is a fantastically interesting problem. And I'm actually doing a series of television programs with Charlie Rose. We're just finishing up the first year series, 12 programs. The next one is on the creative brain. It's going to be shown later next week. And we have Chuck Close. We have Richard, Sarah, and Chuck Close. We thought we'd start with minor artists and then build up to some Austrian artists. Chuck Close is in it. You all know who Chuck Close is, a portrait painter whose birthday is tomorrow. 70th birthday, and I'm going to it. Amazing man. He is dyslexic and prosopagnosis. He does not recognize faces. He's the only portrait painter in the history of Western art who doesn't recognize a damn face. The reason he takes the photograph and squashes it down is because when it's flat, he can deal with it. As a three-dimensional face, he can't recognize it. Yeah, it's really interesting. But you're right, as people age, there's a weakening in recognition of memory, exactly of faces. How that occurs, I don't really know. There are interesting things about faces. Let me tell you some interesting things about faces. We should stop. You must be getting tired of this. Faces are fantastically interesting because it really brings back to the, why is it that people all of a sudden turn out to do horrible things under certain circumstances? There isn't the development of the psyche, a period called the critical period. And it varies for the particular skill from 2 years to 4 years or from 2 years to puberty. Face recognition is sensitive to critical period. So when you're 2 or 3 years old, you can learn to distinguish every single face that you encounter. If you are exposed to 100 monkeys, you can learn to distinguish every single monkey in the group, okay? After this critical period, if you don't see monkeys, all monkeys look alike. You can no longer make fine distinctions. You make fantastic distinctions, even better distinctions that people interact with. See, if you hang around with Jewish people, you have no difficulty recognizing one Jew from another in the dark. But monkeys you can't recognize. And it is my guess that this xenophobia has one component of this. That as we're comfortable with certain faces, we see other kinds of faces. We say, this looks dangerous. This is not what I can recognize. And many Orientals will say, all Europeans and Americans look the same to me. I cannot make the distinction.
Thank you.